grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile build theory crafting discussion. I'm going to be putting out some information about builds that I'm thinking of playing during the Legion expansion shortly. But just before the 2020 gems are revealed, I wanted to go through some of the principles that I use in how to design a build. So, first up, you need to sort out your life and resistances first. If your build can't endure damage, it can't dish it out. You don't necessarily need to go for absolutely stunningly huge amounts of life and resistances, but you do need to get your resistances to 75%, and that's after the 60% merciless penalty, or now it's the mapping penalty, the Act 10 Katava penalty. And you also need to get your life to at least a reasonable amount. That's going to vary for builds. If you're in close combat, you want to have about 5,500 to 7,000 life by level 90. If you're playing a build that can stand at range, you can go for 1,000 less than that. So you will mostly get your resist from gear, so they aren't a big deal on the passive tree. But life must be on both your gear and the passive tree. You'll generally get flat life on gear and percentage life on the tree. You're also going to need to get 3,000 accuracy on an endgame melee build, I believe. I'll need to check this out, and once we get the exact formula, once it's been either worked out or data mined, we can discuss that further. But for the moment, expect that 3,000 accuracy is the new 75% fire resist. It's something you need to have, but you can put it off a bit longer. You can put that off as something that you try to get while you're in red maps. But this build video is about critical strikes, and so I'm going to focus everything else on them. Firstly, critical strikes are an example of a mechanic that has escalating returns. Each node that you take is better than the one before it for critical strikes. This is because of the way that they scale. Basically, there are three axes of scaling critical strikes that are all linear and multiply with each other. First up, you will scale base criticals. This is hard to do, and you will have very few options to do it. This is the critical strike percentage that is listed on your skill gem if you're using a spell, or that is listed on your weapon if you are using an attack. This can be scaled by use of the increased critical strikes support gem. The Slayer Ascendancy has a node that does it, or just simply by electing to use a different type of base weapon. That's really the only ways that you can scale it, other than also the Assassin has a node as well. So that's basically about it for scaling base critical strikes. As a side note, this is why it is so hard to scale critical strikes on Herald gems, Herald of Ice and the like, because they have a 0% base crit. And so with one of the multipliers being 0, you end up in a really bad situation. Your second axis is percentage critical strike chance, so increased percentage critical strike chance that's found on equipment. This can be used to scale up your critical strikes, and you can get quite a lot of this. It's also found on increased critical strike support gem. It is also found as a quality bonus on some skill gems. However, fundamentally you will mostly get this from power charges, which provide a lot of increased critical strike percentage chance, and from your weapon and from other equipment. And also the passive tree. There's a lot on the passive tree. There is a hell of a lot. Next up is percentage critical strike multiplier. This is basically one of the most difficult things to find on the passive tree. And because all of these different factors multiply with each other, so your base crit, your critical strike chance, and your crit multi multiply with each other to determine the amount of damage you're dealing, this makes critical strike multiplier on gear a very precious stat. One of the deafening essences can be used to force items to have quite a large amount of crit multi on it. There's also a number of very highly prized passive nodes on the skill tree, such as Throat Seeker, which give you a lot of crit multiplier. Even small critical multiplier nodes are quite good value on the tree. Now, going crit does a few things. Firstly, it gives you an enormous amount of extra damage. Critical strikes just do a lot of damage by themselves. Secondly, it makes ailments better. So freeze, shock, ignite, and bleed. Poison is an exception. Actually, I'm not sure if bleed works, so I'll have to check that. But yeah, definitely freeze, shock, and ignite all get better with crit. And pseudo ailments, which is my term for things like stun, that aren't actually an ailment but function like one. You are much more likely to stun enemies, you are much more likely to freeze them, you are much more likely to chill them and shock them and ignite them if you are attacking with a crit. Secondly, crits also help you with, firstly, critical strikes have a weakness in that they often can waste a lot of damage over killing enemies, but you can turn this to your advantage and by using Herald of Ash. Herald of Ash, if you hit a monster that has 10,000 health and you do 1,000,000 damage to it, Herald of Ash will take a percentage of that wasted 990,000 damage and will give you some value for it. So Herald of Ash is something that's quite good on critical strike builds. In fact, all of the heralds, with the exception of Herald of Agony, are considerably better when you are doing critical strikes. Now, once you invest in critical strikes are considerably better than non-crit. Because you've got these 3 layers that multiply together, whilst early on you're not getting much benefit out of taking a given critical strikes node, once you've got a bunch of investment, each new critical multiplier node isn't just, say, taking you from doing 320% to 340% of base damage on 4% of your attacks, which is a terrible bonus. It's taking you from doing 320 to 340% on perhaps 55 or 60% of attacks, which is a much more significant bonus to your damage. Going critical strikes versus going non-crit is the biggest decision you will make other than your skill, and it will often influence the class and ascendancy that you choose to go. The ascendancies that have particular synergies with crits are the Slayer, the Assassin, the Berserker, the Elementalist, and the Inquisitor. But you should still consider others, even if you decide to go critical strikes. Juggernaut is a popular critical strike ascendancy, even though it doesn't interact much with crits directly. It just rounds out all of your defenses in one package and also your accuracy, and gives you a lot of attack speed, which then allows you to seek critical strike elsewhere. Now, when it comes to building crit, you will want to consider that you'll want to consider the passive tree as well. You'll need to first target the absolutely essential functions of your skill and your build. So for instance, if you're a build that relies extremely heavily upon the keystone Elemental Equilibrium, then you are going to need to prioritize getting Elemental Equilibrium. That should be pretty obvious, but you need to path to the essentials. That's the very first decision that you make when designing a tree on a crit build. Secondly, you'll need to get your life or your energy shield. Energy shield's going to be out of favor with a lot of players in 3.7. I don't think it'll be unplayable. But I think it will be much less common than it was, well, certainly in 3.6. But I think we're returning to a situation where energy shield will be a niche choice rather than the default choice, with life being the thing that people do because they're not confident in building energy shield characters. Once you've got life and energy or energy shield sorted, then you next want to look for crit multiplier. After that, you then want to start filling out your tree with other high quality nodes. For distant nodes, you want to consider the opportunity cost of pathing to them. So for example, a jewel that takes 2 passive points is an exceptional deal because there's not much else you can do with those 2 points that's going to compete with a jewel, even assuming you don't have, that it's early league and you don't have access to good jewels yet. A 3-socket jewel has a higher opportunity cost because you could potentially take a small cluster somewhere else, and a 4-socket jewel is a much higher opportunity cost again. And the same thing goes for utility passives that are not jewels. So for instance, one of my favorite nodes, it's one that I personally overvalue, I just love the node, is Overcharged, which had previously been behind Conduit. And what the whole cluster of 3 nodes does is it gives you a 12% chance on killing an enemy to generate a random charge. So that can be Endurance, Power, or Frenzy. And this is something I really like, but there is an opportunity cost to taking it because it helps your character, yes, but you could have done something else with those 3 nodes. Now, not all nodes are created equally. Some nodes on the tree, and I'll name Constitution in the Scion Life Wheel and Soul of Steel, which has been buffed and is incredible in 3.7. These nodes are amazing, and as a result, they can sometimes be worth going a little bit out of your way to get. That becomes a bit of a balancing and optimization challenge. But if you follow the core principles of essential functions of your skill first, life second, and crit multi third, and then filling out with high quality nodes, Even if you don't succeed in completely optimizing your tree, you'll get something decent. One thing I suggest you do is that you take your critical strike related nodes later in your character progression, and you also take weapon specific nodes. So for instance, ones that only function on swords later in your character progression as well. This is because those nodes are less useful to you while you're leveling up. Sword nodes are less useful because while you're leveling, you might have some amazing axe drop. Like you might get the Blood Reaper, I think it's called. There's an axe that is one of the best weapons for mid-level leveling, like for, say, Act 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's one of the best weapons you can get in that level range, and you're definitely going to want to use that, even if you have a sword that would otherwise be adequate. So take your weapon-specific nodes later once you are at the point of either crafting your own weapons or trading for them. Now, the last thing that I want to point out is that power charges are an essential part of a critical strikes build. They provide a large amount of percentage critical strikes gain, and these are something that your build will need to be generating itself if you're playing a critical strikes build. You will need to find a way to generate them. So endurance and frenzy charges you may or may not want to bother with, but power charges you must. There's a couple of options for doing this. You can take, perhaps your Ascendancy might provide you with some source of power charges. So for instance, various channeling skill builds with tricksters, particularly popular in 3.6, but some of them that are not named Winter Orb will still remain viable in 3.7, and some people think Winter Orb, some people are more optimistic about Winter Orb's future than I am. Some people think it will still be fine in 3.7, but in any case, the trickster builds there, they get it from their Ascendancy. They get both power and endurance charges that way. So you may get it from your Ascendancy, your power charges, but if you don't, you'll need to find a source for them. Assassin's Mark, the Curse, is a popular source, and power charge on critical strike support is another popular one. Anyways, I hope that helps demystify some of the basics of building around critical strikes. If you've got any questions, fire away below. I've had to film this one while I've been on my lunch break at work, but the schedule for the rest of the day, I'm going to try and start recording a whole bunch of build videos tonight, so that'll be within the next sort of 9 to 12 hours. I should have my first 1 or 2 up, and then I'll dribble the rest of them out over the period from now until a few hours before leagues start. If you've got any questions, fire away below. Otherwise, have a good one.